If you've been watching my recent underrated card videos, you know that I proclaimed Jungle Lickitung as the most underrated card in the base set era, and I'm here to prove it. 90 HP, a resistance to Psychic, and a 1 energy attack that is Stall incarnate. This is the Stall card. Fuck Chansey. This deck list also includes 2 other underrated cards that made my list that are premium Stall cards. When testing this deck against other Stall builds that I've used on the channel like Fossil Stall or Damage Swap, this deck wins the majority of the time. It does struggle a little bit against decks like Wildfire that are Stall plus mill, but if you use the Puka build of this deck, it also includes 1 copy of Moltres and a couple of Magmars, but I'll get into that after this build. For now, let's look at straight up Licky Stall. Shout out again to Puka and Jason Klaczynski for kind of hyping up Lickitung and getting it to the level that I've always held it as, and really getting this kind of deck more well known for the base set era community. This deck, of course, uses Lickitung. 3 copies, in fact. It's not going to be your first choice as an attacker. It'll definitely be the primary attacker for the deck as a whole, but early game, it's much better to start with a Kangaskhan. That way you have that draw power going on. This deck does not have very much draw power in it. Because it's Stall, you're kind of forcing your opponent to deck out before you. And most other decks are going to be running a lot of Bill, a lot of Professor Oak, and they're going to go through their deck a lot faster than you. So using Fetch to only draw 1 card is not going to be counter to the Stall strategy. Kangaskhan and Lickitung both have 90 HP, so they're not going to get O-Code or anything very early game, if at all. They're going to be able to sponge up damage, get back to the bench, and you also have 2 copies of Mr. Mime in this deck to move in when your opponent has a fully set up Blastoise, or a Venusaur, or a Mewtwo, or just a Hitmonchan that needs to be taken care of. Mr. Mime can deal with those very easily. This deck will be running 3 copies of that promo Mewtwo, which can be a very simple way to scare your opponent's Hitmonchans away, or under-evolved Pokemon like a Squirtle or a Bulbasaur that can't really handle a Mewtwo, and that's going to buy you another turn while that card retreats to the bench. Now I'm also putting a copy of Promo Mew in this deck, mainly as a situational late game threat, for Psybeam can really deal a huge chunk of damage to something like a Blastoise, and can be really scary to some evolved Pokemon that already have chunks of damage on them that have been provided by Mr. Mime or that promo Mewtwo. And that way this deck has a little bit of an answer for everything. If your opponent thinks that it's full Stall, they're going to go forward with their strategy, try to just get O-Codes off of those Lickitung and Kangaskhan, but not realize that you also have all of these backup Psychic cards that can deal some hefty damage when needed. This is an offensive Stall deck where you can win by taking prizes just as easily as deck outs. Energy removal and super energy removal are going to help stall out your opponent. They're going to keep them from getting those big attacks off. With full playsets of each, it's going to be hard for your opponent to really keep a lot of energy on their Pokemon, and discarding the Psychic energy for super energy removal actually plays into your strategy pretty well late game, as you can bring in Mewtwo and use energy absorption to get those right out of the discard and power up Psyburn. That fact also gives you a little bit of freedom with Scoop Up, as when you use Scoop Up, any energy attached to that Pokemon are going to be discarded. So knowing that scooping a Mr. Mime when it's in danger, depriving your opponent of an easy prize, isn't going to be completely lost, as you can use Mewtwo to get those energy back. Mr. Fuji is going to be for those cases where you don't want to lose those attached energy. This deck runs double colorless energy specifically for Kangaskhan's Comet Punch, because that can be a devastating attack that isn't expected. But as you use it, Kangaskhan will accumulate a lot of damage on it. Thankfully, it can hold all that damage with its 90 HP. But in those cases, you don't want to give your opponent a prize, and so Mr. Fuji is a great way to just put it right back in your deck with all of the energy attached to it. But in those cases where Lickitung and Kangaskhan have been sponging energy, but they only have 1 energy attached to them using Tongue Wrap and Fetch, then Pokemon Center is going to be the go-to. It's going to clear all those damage counters off, and it will discard a couple of energy, but again, Mewtwo lacks those energy in the discard, so it's not a problem. These 3 copies of Professor Oak are going to be used very sparingly. If anything, you're really only going to need to use 1 of them. That's if you don't start the game with Kangaskhan's draw power and you really just need to get some Pokemon into your hand onto the field. Otherwise, it's just going to be a throwaway card to use for computer search or item finder, since Professor Oak is really only meant for early game speedy setup. And that's not what this deck is about. This deck is about outlasting your opponent. As soon as a Pokemon is in danger of being knocked out next turn, you are either going to use Pokemon Center to heal it, or you're going to use Scoop Up or Fuji to get it off of the playing field. It doesn't matter how much energy you're losing by doing that, because there are 3 copies of energy removal in this deck as well, with Item Finder to recycle those if needed. The main point is to keep your opponent from taking prizes. And in that regard, this deck can be amazingly frustrating to play against. You'll put a lot of damage on a Pokemon, and you'll have a Gust in hand, so you'll think, oh yeah, even if they go to the bench, I got them. Next turn, I can just pull it back out, get that easy KO with Gust of Wind, and then on your opponent's turn, they'll just completely remove it from the playing field, and you don't have that option anymore. You have to figure something else out. In the meantime, this deck's probably got an answer for whatever your setup is. Mr. Mime is there to deal with high damage output decks like Blastoise, Wigglytuff, Arcanine. Meanwhile, if your opponent has something like Hitmonchan, Electabuzz, or Magmar, that's where your sponge cards are going to come in, like Lickitung and Kangaskhan. Lickitung especially can stall out any of those attackers for as long as it needs to, and for only 1 energy, so it's not going to care about energy removal all that much. The deck can be hampered a little bit from a Lass on your opponent's side of the field, but that's when Kangaskhan comes in and will just fetch you an extra card every turn and help you bounce back from that Lass while absorbing damage. If at any point your opponent needs an extra turn to set up, or if they're vulnerable for a turn after you've fired off a bunch of energy removals against them, that's when you can swap in Mewtwo and just go to town. And that's going to be a huge advantage of this deck, especially against an opponent that doesn't know what deck you're using yet. Attacking with just Lickitung or Mr. Mime, they're going to expect stall, but they're not going to know how fast you can shift gears into offense with that Mewtwo, or potentially even a Mew late game. You may be thinking, how exactly are you just going to swap in Mewtwo for late game easy kills when all these Pokemon have 3 retreat costs and you don't run Switch in this deck? Well, the answer is you're just going to scoop your active and pull in something from your bench. But if you don't want to have to rely on getting a scoop into your hand exactly when you need it, then go ahead and include a few copies of Switch. The same goes for Lass. This deck is susceptible to Lass, but if you don't want to have to rely on Kangaskhan to bounce back from that, well, the best way to deal with Lass is by playing Lass yourself. It's one of the many lessons learned from Insanity. If you don't want to go offensive stall, I did mention earlier that there's a Puka version of this deck. If you want to learn more about that, I'll link the J-Wits video down in the description, but basically, he ran this version of stall, but instead of the psychic types, he included 3 copies of Fossil Magmar, which is a great stall card on its own, with Smokescreen buying you a lot of extra time per game, and a single copy of Fossil Moltres with Wildfire, which utilizes that same fire energy, and in this way shifting from offensive stall to stall plus meal, whereas you're forcing your opponent to go through their cards much faster and ending the game a lot sooner by decking them out. In testing these 2 builds against one another, I found that they really trade licks a lot, pun intended, as Moltres is hard to knock out when you're only utilizing Lickitung and Mr. Mime, and in that time, Wildfire is able to mill through a lot of your deck. But also, with as much energy removal and super energy removal that's included in this deck, Wildfire can be really difficult to set up, especially when your opponent's energy removals aren't having as much of an effect on your Kangaskhan and Lickitung, as they only really need 1 energy to attack anyway. It's really up to your personal playstyle on which version you like better, but for me, I much prefer this Jason Klosinski style build that can switch between stall and offense very quickly, and most of the time do both at the same time. But if you do want to go more towards the Wildfire stall, you could include cards like Maintenance, Gambler, or Imposter Oak to lean more into that meal side of all of this, as long as your main takeaway from these builds is that Lickitung is king or queen of the base set era, whether players realize it or not. As I come to the end of the base set era and the base Neo playlist, I've got some fun videos coming up, some request decks, some really just out there decks, and I'm really looking forward to getting into Neo On a little later this summer. So stay tuned to the channel for all of that vintage Pokemon TCG goodness. If you want to find me on social media, you can do so at any of the links down in the description, and I will see you next video. Goodbye.